Good evening. Leading the news this Thursday, the Supreme Court said federally funded clinics may not give abortion advice. President Bush reacted coolly to a Soviet request for financial help. The House of Representatives voted to give President Bush broad leeway in negotiating a free trade agreement with Mexico. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, the Supreme Court abortion decision as explained by Nina Totenberg. The debate over testing medical personnel and patients for AIDS with a Kwame Holman report and two doctors who disagree. And finally, the question of U.S. economic aid for the Soviet Union.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T connects the world. From equipment to networking, from computers to communications, AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo. And made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The Supreme Court issued a major decision today on abortion. It approved a government ban on discussing abortion at family planning clinics which receive federal funds. The Reagan administration issued the regulation in 1988. It has never been enforced because of legal challenges. Today's vote was 5-4. The newest justice, David Souter, voted with a majority in his first abortion case. The decision brought reaction from both sides of the issue.
The court has given the government the green light to impose restrictions on women and on speech and on doctors, and have reestablished a separate but unequal justice in America in health care.
We're gratified that the Supreme Court has upheld these regulations, which make a distinction between abortion and birth control. Groups like Planned Parenthood believe that they should be able to treat abortion as just another method of family planning, and that's why these regulations were needed, to re-erect the barrier that used to exist in this program between abortion and birth control.
We'll have more on the story right after this news summary. Robin?
President Bush today appointed General Colin Powell to a second term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He made the announcement in the White House Rose Garden with Powell and Defense Secretary Dick Cheney at his side. Mr. Bush praised Powell's leadership during the Gulf War and said there was no one more qualified to lead the armed forces. The president was asked about Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's request for financial aid from the West. Mr. Bush said he hasn't received such a proposal formally, but he said he and other Western leaders are interested in helping the Soviet Union. More on this story later in the program. Also today, the president defended Secretary of State James Baker. Baker drew criticism for his remarks yesterday that there is no bigger obstacle to Mideast peace than Israel's continued construction of settlements on the West Bank.
Secretary Baker was speaking for this administration, and I strongly support what he said, and I strongly support what he's trying to do. There's no light between anyone in the administration, and our policy, as I said earlier, is well known, and it would make a big contribution to peace if these settlements would stop, and that's what the Secretary was trying to say, and I thought he said it very well, and I am 100% for him. I noticed some interpretive story today that suggested that I was lightening up. I'm backing the man. He's knocking himself out, going the extra mile for peace. And one way to go get there is to have this, the settlement policy under control.
Earlier in the day, Secretary Baker had appeared at another hearing on Capitol Hill. Several senators told him he was wrong to single out Israel.
Mr. Secretary, is the settlement activity more of a threat to peace than Syria's recent delivery of North Korean Scud missiles? More than the state of war that Arab nations have maintained against Israel since its inception?
I will say one more time, there is no bigger obstacle than the continued enhanced settlement activity that we see going on in the territories. Because what that does is it tends to make the parties we are trying to bring to the table with Israel think that they tend to think that Israel is not interested in negotiations, but only in creating facts on the ground. It is equally important, in my view, that the Arab states recognize the obstacle to peace that is presented by the state of belligerency that continues to exist between them and Israel.
The United Nations and Iraq today signed an agreement permitting the dispatch of UN guards to Kurdish refugee camps. UN officials said about 400 to 500 UN guards will replace Allied soldiers now protecting Kurdish refugees returning to Iraq.
In India today, Rajiv Gandhi's widow turned down the leadership of her dead husband's political party. Sonia Gandhi declined the offer from the Congress Party. She was chosen following the assassination of her husband Tuesday. Mark Austin of Independent Television News reports from New Delhi.
In the early hours of this morning, a brother and sister reunited in grief. Rajiv Gandhi's son, Rahul, flew in from America, greeted by sister Priyanka. The young heirs to the Gandhi dynasty had nothing to say. As they were whisked away, a new level of security was apparent. Personal guards with automatic weapons, and they're riding in bulletproof cars. It was to his father's body that the car immediately took Rahul. There he joined his mother, Sonia, in an act of family respect that lasted till daylight. Indians don't consider Italian-born Sonia as a genuine Gandhi. There's already speculation that Rahul may now be under pressure to enter politics in the near future. All day they've been filing past the former Prime Minister's coffin. Thousands of people paying their respects before his cremation tomorrow. On the streets of the capital, the army has been patrolling, but with little to do. In the aftermath of Gandhi's assassination, the feared explosion of violence has not materialized. The preparations are underway for the funeral. The pyre will be built at the riverside site where his mother was cremated 7 years ago.
Indian police today said Gandhi was killed by a woman suicide bomber. They said she was believed to be a member of a rebel group fighting for a separate homeland in Sri Lanka. She was wearing an explosive device strapped to her body. It detonated when she bowed to greet Gandhi at a campaign rally.
The House today voted to give President Bush expanded authority to negotiate a free trade treaty with Mexico. The vote was 231 to 192. The decision extends for 2 years the president's so-called fast-track authority to make trade pacts without congressional oversight. The president called the vote a very important step for our country. The issue now goes to the Senate, where it's expected to pass.
George McGovern said no today. The 1972 Democratic presidential nominee will not run for president in 1992. He said in a Washington speech he thought he could best promote a liberal Democratic message if he spoke without the distraction of personal ambition. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to the Supreme Court abortion decision, testing for AIDS, and helping the Soviet economy.
Our lead focus tonight is the Supreme Court's decision to let stand a controversial Reagan administration rule on abortion. Charlene Hunter-Gault has more. Charlene?
A sharply divided court today ruled that the government can continue to prevent federally funded clinics from counseling women about abortion. The court voted 5-4 to uphold the prohibition on such counseling, saying that the ban did not violate doctors' or patients' free speech rights or the right of women to obtain abortions. Here to tell us more about it is Nina Totenberg, legal affairs correspondent for National Public Radio. Nina, first, just very briefly, how did this case end up in the Supreme Court?
Well, Congress passed a law in 1970 that provided millions of dollars for family planning clinics all over the country, private clinics and state and local clinics, county clinics that provide these services. At that time, Congress said that none of the money could be used to encourage or promote abortion. But the federal regulations, the executive branch regulations that went into effect, said that while you can't promote or encourage abortion, you have to tell the patients what their options are, and if a patient is pregnant, you may refer the patient to an abortion clinic if she wishes. 18 years later, in the waning days of the Reagan administration, the Reagan officials changed those regulations entirely and banned doctors from advising their patients at all about abortion. Even if a patient asked about the option of abortion, a doctor had a script to follow, and he had to tell the patient that abortion is not an appropriate method of family planning. Even if she asked for a referral to an abortion clinic, he could not give it to her.
Well, a number of doctors went to court to block those regulations, and today the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, upheld the regulation.
So in practical terms, what does this mean?
Well, it means that those regulations will stay in effect.
And when a woman goes into an abortion clinic,
she can't find out anything about abortion or her rights to abortion. The doctor must be silent on the subject.
What was the court's reasoning?
Well, Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote the majority opinion for the 5-member court majority, and he said first that since the federal government may favor childbirth over abortion, it may also forbid the use of federal funds to promote or encourage abortion in any way whatsoever. He said that these regulations do not interfere with the doctor-patient relationship because, after all, these clinics don't provide all-encompassing medical care, and any patient would realize that and would not be misled by the doctor's silence.
Now, this is a 5-4 decision, very sharply divided. I understand the dissent was very strong.
The dissent was very strong. Let me just say one other point that the Chief Justice said. He also said that the federal rules did not restrict the women's access to abortion, that their indigency is what restricted their access to abortion, since if they could afford to go to a private doctor, they could find out whatever they want. And the dissent said, led by Justice Blackmun, who wrote Roe versus Wade, the dissent said that the court was, in effect, nullifying Roe versus Wade via the back door by making abortions generally unavailable and turning doctors into propagandists for the anti-abortion point of view.
And just for the record, Roe versus Wade was the case that upheld legal abortions in the country.
Right.
Tell us about David Souter and what this tells us or doesn't tell us about him.
Well, David Souter, the court's newest member, had been questioned repeatedly during his confirmation about his position on abortion, and he refused to say, and this was his first indication of his views on the subject, and he sided with the majority and upheld the regulations. I should note that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the court's only female member, dissented, saying that Congress had not authorized these regulations.
So you think this provides a clue or a hint or a window into how Souter would vote if Roe v. Wade came up before the court?
Well, I don't think it's absolutely determinative, but I think it gives you a pretty strong indication.
What do you think the impact of this decision will be? You've talked to some of the parties on both sides, I gather.
Well, there's both short-range and long-range impact. The short-range impact is that in some 4,000 family planning clinics that serve 5 million American women who are poor, they will have to either live by these rules or close their doors. And a lot of family planning clinics say that they either will forego the federal money. Planned Parenthood says they're not going to take the federal money. But there are a lot of clinics that depend almost entirely on this money for their existence, and some of them may simply close up. So that's the immediate impact. The long-range impact is enormous on the law in many respects. First of all, there are obvious implications for Roe versus Wade. Secondly, this case involved much more than just abortion. If you'll forgive me, it involved speech. It involved the powers of the executive branch. And this decision today gives the executive branch unprecedented power to pass regulations when Congress has spoken ambiguously, as Chief Justice Rehnquist said. And that gives the executive branch enormous new power. Also in the speech area, it basically means for the federal government in any area, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
So that presumably or possibly any institution that receives federal funds like a university or anything else under this ruling conceivably could limit what people in those institutions had to say?
I would say in many institutions. I must say Chief Justice Rehnquist specifically seemed to exempt universities, but that was the only institution he singled out that might be different.
Do you think that this ruling is likely to provoke any congressional reaction?
Well, already we've heard from lots of Democrats and moderate Republicans saying they will immediately introduce legislation to reverse these regulations. Last year, the Senate passed a bill to undo these regulations by a vote of 62 to 36, but that's not enough to override a veto, and President Bush has consistently vetoed every piece of legislation that would ease limitations on abortion.
Well, based on what you've heard from proponents and opponents of this, do you think there's going to be a fight over it?
Well, I'm sure there'll be a fight over it, but in the end, I would surmise that either Congress has to have a two-thirds majority to override a veto, or what the Supreme Court ruled today in upholding these regulations is going to remain the law of the land.
We've got 20 seconds, Nina. Can you tell us the future implications for Roe v. Wade? I mean, do you see a real challenge coming now?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but we know that there are states that are trying to make abortion criminal. And that probably is the next kind of case that will come before the Supreme Court, testing Roe versus Wade. Can a doctor go to jail for performing an abortion?
All right. Well, Nina Totenberg, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Charlene.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, AIDS testing and fixing the Soviet economy. Testing for AIDS is where we go next. The specific question concerns doctors and hospital patients. The New England Journal of Medicine said in an editorial today there should be AIDS screening of both. The timing as well as the message makes headlines because today it was also announced that a dentist who treated patients in a Maryland prison died of AIDS. Health officials are tracking thousands of inmates he treated. We will have a full debate following this backgrounder from the patient's perspective by Kwame Holman.
It happened to Kimberly Bergalis, and suddenly almost everyone felt at risk. Last summer, federal authorities documented that the 22-year-old Florida resident was the first person in the United States to contract AIDS during dental treatment. The Centers for Disease Control kept her identity secret, but she chose a public stand.
If this can be prevented from happening to another family, then that needs to be done.
Bergalis, who said she had no other risk factors for AIDS, had had 2 teeth extracted in 1987. Health officials at first dismissed her claim that her dentist, Dr. David Acker, then rumored to be dying of AIDS, may have infected her. But a new laboratory technique called DNA sequencing showed that the strains of virus infecting both doctor and patient were almost identical, meaning the 2 cases were somehow linked. Then in January, the CDC reported 2 more cases of HIV infection linked to Dr. Acker. Barbara Webb was treated for a toothache on the same day Kimberly Bergalis had molars pulled. And Richard Driscoll, who on one visit in 1989 had his teeth cleaned the same day as Barbara Webb. Webb says the dentist diagnosed in 1987 never told his patients he had AIDS.
If I were forced to talk to him, I think I would ask him why he did something so terrible to 3 people and potentially more. How he could find it in his conscience to treat people when he had AIDS and he knew it.
No one knows exactly how Acker's patients became infected. 2 days before his death, the dentist published an emotional statement claiming he had, quote, strictly adhered to the CDC's infection control guidelines. And as for telling his patients, well, for years the CDC has maintained that the risk to patients from HIV-infected healthcare workers is so small, actually hundreds of times smaller than the risk to healthcare workers from infected patients, that disclosure is unnecessary. But with the emergence of the Florida cases and mounting public fear bordering on panic, the agency felt new pressure to change its stance. As the CDC grappled with that issue, stories of doctors and dentists with AIDS made headlines. The state of Delaware offered free AIDS tests to patients of a dentist who had died 2 weeks earlier. An Ohio hospital dusted off the patient files of a surgeon whose death from AIDS was reported in 1988. And back in Florida, an orthodontist with AIDS closed up shop and advised his patients to be tested. But nowhere was the public outcry louder than in Baltimore, Maryland, where residents awoke one Sunday morning to this banner headline. The doctor was Rudolph Almarez, a prominent surgeon specializing in breast cancer, who counted movie stars and the wives of presidents among his patients. Although some of those patients now say they suspected he had AIDS, they feel betrayed that he didn't tell them.
It's a terrible tragedy that Rudolph Almarez
had AIDS, and it's a terrible tragedy that he died. But I don't think it's right that he continued to do invasive procedures without the informed consent of his patients, or at least me anyway.
I mean, even though they say the chances are very slim that he nicked himself and that blood fell into my chest cavity, I don't know that. And I might be just that one person that happened to.
Johns Hopkins Hospital, where Almaraz operated, sent letters to his patients offering free testing and counseling. Almost immediately, Baltimore lawyers sprang into action.
The right of privacy does not extend to murder.
Jonathan Shukor specializes in personal injury and medical malpractice litigation. He's filed 2 suits for more than $30 million each against Hopkins and the Almaraz estate, and has up to 30 more cases in the works.
Are any of your clients currently HIV positive, and are you advising them to take any particular medical steps?
At this point, I know of no HIV client. That does not mean that we won't know of one tomorrow or the next day. We simply do not know. It is early on in the process. At the least, these people are going through serial blood tests where they're being tested for AIDS.
Would you still have a case if none of your clients ever became HIV positive?
Absolutely. The fear of this disease, the anxiety that they go through, the sleepless nights, the need for serial testing called surveillance damages, they have to keep going back to these tests. I don't think any of us want to walk around every day wondering whether we have the disease or not.
95% of all people who become infected with the AIDS virus show a positive test result within 6 months of exposure. 5% can take up to 2 years to become HIV positive. Although Suzanne Rittmiller was operated on by Rudolph Almaraz 2.5 years ago and has tested negative twice, she still feels at risk.
I am in panic. It happened to me, and something should be done about it.
Rittmiller has consulted a lawyer. Terry Warren has not. She is HIV negative 2 years after her mastectomy.
I don't feel that any harm was done me, and I feel lucky to have had Dr. Almaraz as a surgeon when I did. I don't think I have any grounds for a lawsuit. I have problems with the fact that lawsuits are being filed by people who, as far as we know, did not contract AIDS.
You may actually have felt differently about Rudolph Almaraz if he had operated on you when he had open sores on his face and hands. He did when he operated on me.
Linda Schoeffel was operated on by Dr. Almaraz in February 1990, the month before he became too ill to work. She and Suzanne Rittmiller both believe HIV-positive healthcare workers should be barred from performing invasive procedures.
Why even take the chance? Why even take that risk? Even though Dr. Almaraz is one of the best, no one is indispensable, and you could find probably just as good surgeon anywhere else.
He was so talented at what he did, and very brilliant, that he could certainly have been a consultant or taught and been very successful anyway, without doing the actual surgery.
It's pure fiction to imagine that a surgeon who was performing abdominal surgery, let's say, all of a sudden will be hired by a hospital just to do teaching.
Dr. Hasib Aoun speaks from experience. In 1983, as a cardiologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital, he contracted AIDS from a patient. His highly promising career was finished.
Even looking for academic jobs, teaching house staff, and not involved into doing any invasive procedures at all. Your credentials, all of a sudden, are not the important matter. What is important is that you're HIV infected. And then the doors close in a way that they will not have closed before you'll not have been infected.
Dr. Aoun now writes and lectures and has become a leading advocate for the rights of HIV-infected healthcare workers. He believes they can continue to practice and even perform all but a few invasive procedures safely. In recent testimony at the CDC, he urged the agency not to base its policy solely on the Florida cases.
And there are many more risks to patients at hospitals, much more significant than AIDS. I'll give you an example. Cardiac catheterization. Well, cardiac catheterization is an important diagnostic procedure. Some patients die from it. We don't just cancel out the procedure because it's useful. Well, similarly, all these HIV-infected professionals, they're still very useful for society and for themselves, for their own families. And removing them from the practice of medicine, from patient contact, is almost criminal. And it establishes a vicious cycle that will never stop. You feed into the fears of the public instead of educating the public by issuing restrictive guidelines that are not based on science.
Apart from the patients in Florida, the science so far, based on 3 published studies, shows no cases of a doctor transmitting AIDS to patients. But many say that's not enough proof to conclude that the risk is minute.
We simply don't know who the other physicians and surgeons are, so how do we look at who their patients are? How do we know how many AIDS-infected, HIV-positive patients there are in this country who contracted the disease in an operating room or a procedure room?
Shakur and many others say healthcare providers who perform invasive procedures should be tested regularly and required to inform their patients if they become infected with AIDS.
There ought to be no physician that subjects you or any listener to the threat of AIDS without disclosing that threat before any invasive procedure is done. Because there's no reason for any of us to get this disease because a physician or surgeon doesn't feel it necessary to tell us about it.
I certainly think we all should have known. Unfortunately, I think that Rudy Alvarez understood that he would not be allowed to continue practicing at Hopkins, that he would not have any patients. He was not in a position to say, I'm a surgeon, would you like to have me perform surgery knowing that I have AIDS? That would never have been a choice. I think we need to provide healthcare professionals with some sort of real alternatives that they can be doing some sort of valuable work and provide them with some confidentiality before we say you must disclose this information. I would like to have known, but not at that cost.
Now to our debate. Dr. Marcia Angel is the executive editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Angel wrote today's editorial calling for routine testing of healthcare workers as well as hospital patients. She joins us from Boston. Dr. June Osborne is the chairman of the National Commission on AIDS and is the dean of the University of Michigan School of Public Health. She is in Detroit. Dr. Angel, what is your argument for testing patients and healthcare professionals?
Well, it's a part of a larger argument. What I'm advocating is a two-pronged attack on the AIDS epidemic, because I think that the AIDS epidemic presents 2 rather distinct sets of issues. The first is the issue of discrimination. People who are diagnosed as being infected with the HIV virus are vulnerable to all sorts of discrimination, and in particular to the loss of their jobs, of their housing, and of their insurance benefits. They also are vulnerable to economic devastation. The second set of problems is a problem of trying to control this major epidemic. And the traditional way such an epidemic would be controlled would be to find out who is infected, and then to take steps to try to protect their sexual partners and others at risk. We've done rather poorly at both sets of problems because I think we're concerned, we're confused about the goals of both sets. We're concerned about discrimination, as well we should be, and so what we've done is say, well, let's not have routine testing because there might be discrimination. What I'm suggesting is that we address both of these problems explicitly. We address the discrimination problem by passing laws saying that people can't lose their jobs or their housing or their insurance, and I've suggested in the editorial today that there be a federal program that would pay for the medical care of anyone who's HIV infected, just as we have a federal program that pays for anyone who has kidney failure. Then if we can take care of these tangible repercussions of being HIV infected, then we can move on to trying to control the epidemic. And to do this, I've advocated testing both patients and healthcare providers who do invasive procedures, as well as pregnant women and newborns. I also advocate contact tracing and partner notification.
Well, on the testing of healthcare providers specifically, what would happen following the testing? In other words, what would happen to the healthcare provider who tested positive HIV?
Yes. I would think such a person should not be doing invasive procedures. I can't imagine that very many patients would want him or her to be doing so. But there are plenty of non-invasive roles to play in medicine. There could be some insurance programs, some pooling of risks, either by the providers themselves, professional groups, or by institutions that would permit retraining. Or conceivably, there could be early retirement. But I think that they should be removed from invasive procedures.
Dr. Osborne, what's your view, first of all, on testing patients and healthcare providers?
Well, my view on the general issue is that we should all be very much concerned about safety, and that we should therefore focus the discussion and any proposed actions on issues of safety. HIV is so much lower on the hierarchy of threats to safety in the healthcare workplace than a dozen other things that I think we have misfocused the entire debate. We, meaning the people debating right now. I think the CDC very wisely in 1987 instituted universal precautions, recommendations in order to meet the overall issue of safety from infectious agents in the healthcare workplace, of which many are much more important and much more likely to be transmitted. In fact, I'm going to use that as an example of how effective those universal precautions recommendations have been, because prior to 1987, at a low but fairly consistent frequency, hepatitis B was transmitted in the medical as well as dental and other healthcare workplaces. There have been no transmissions since 1987, thanks to, and it coincides wonderfully with the institution of the recommendation of universal precautions. In fact, I think if we let the fright and understandable fear of HIV, it's a new thing and people are understandably frightened and concerned, I think if we let that take charge of our common sense, we could do considerable harm to public health in the workplace, because the universal precautions was in fact a step forward, and I think it would lapse backwards if people started excluding on the basis of HIV.
So you have no sympathy then for the three women who are on the tape who said we should have known, and we were very upset that we were not told that a man operated on us who had AIDS?
I have great sympathy for people around the country right now, because the level of frightened debate has been very high, and I think it's been very difficult for thoughtful people to get a sense of order of magnitude of risk. In point of fact, there has never been an instance of transmission of HIV from a physician to a person under care. The statement made that we don't know that sounds as if we were just starting out looking and that we were starting out with a new epidemic. I think it's important to recognize that what the epidemic is recognized as 10 years old, and the virus has been identifiable for 8 years. It actually has been epidemic in this country at a very high level for more like 20 years, because it takes quite a long while to express itself. The instances in which people don't seroconvert until after several months are very rare.
What is that? What's seroconvert?
Turn from antibody negative to positive, so that people who go to see if they've been infected can be reassured. Those instances have all been in very high-risk communities, and in point of fact, the antibody tests that we have now should be quite reassuring. But I'm afraid this whole debate has gotten tangled with a sense of panic that's inappropriate to the fact that there has never been a transmission from a surgeon in an operating room to his patient. And in point of fact, the instances that we know about from Florida, every case of AIDS is tragic, and those are too. But those instances, after very careful two-day review at CDC, were felt, I think, by most people to reflect the early stage and perhaps imperfect stage of universal precautions and sterilization procedures in the dentist's office.
Dr. Angel, are you reacting to fear and panic to a problem that really doesn't exist?
No, I thought I was reacting with common sense. I think it's unrealistic to believe that people can maintain the highest level of vigilance with every patient. I just don't think that can happen, and yet that's what universal precautions suggest. As far as the risk goes, I agree with Dr. Osborne that the risk is probably very, very small, and particularly small from doctor or nurse to patient. But we still don't know exactly what it is. We can't be sure what it is, and it is possible. So I see no reason against testing these populations that I mentioned.
Dr. Osborne, first of all, let me make sure that we understand what both of y'all are talking about when you talk about universal precautions. There you're talking about rubber gloves and sterilization of equipment, all of those kinds of things, right, that don't have anything to do directly with the provider. It has to do with the equipment that he or she uses. Is that correct?
Yes, and the kinds of contacts that will happen between the patient and the person caring for the patient, whatever the kinds of barriers that can be set up can be.
Okay, but let's go back to, Doc, you pointed out some things, but specifically, what would be the harm in doing what Dr. Angel is saying? Who would get hurt if Dr. Angel's proposals go into effect?
Well, I think all of us would get hurt. I think that it is a sense of false security to think that we have enough trained healthcare professionals in this country. We do not, and we're coming up to a time when we're going to have an enormous number of young adults needing care, so that to needlessly exempt healthcare professionals from the healthcare